I will open it up for Q&A. And as we probably, if you've been part of these before, you know, I've come from 5 generations around Northville, and my father was the historian for most of his 98 years, and my grandfathers before them in town. So I've grown up with the stories and enjoy Northville tremendously. Let's kind of get in the feel of things and look at back in 1927, Northville celebrated their 100th anniversary, and they had the largest parade ever in the state of Michigan, right here in Northville, Michigan. And Henry Ford helped put that together. And I kind of dressed in that Victorian garb because this week, what is it? It's the Victorian Heritage Festival. So trying to get us in the mood. Let's see if we can get these technical difficulties sorted out and put that movie on. Wendy, let her rip. That would be great if we could do that. Those are my grandparents in the Model T truck, my grandmother in the back doing wash, don't you know? Logging was big in the Northville area too. Pasadena, it didn't have anything on us with all our flowers and everything on all these floats and whatnot. That's Mr. Stinson, who used to build airplanes right here on Norfolk Road. He's behind the wheel of that plane. And all the churches had their floats back then.
Brian?
I think we can shut her down, Wendy, and just let's start the presentation if that works for you. Great. So hopefully that gives you a feel. Again, I've done this for about the past decade. My dad did it for many, many years, about the history of Northville and different activities. And that Centennial Parade was kind of special to us because my grandparents were in there, and my dad, one of those kids running around was him at about 10 years old back in the late 20s. And all the names that you hear from around Northville, they were in that parade. If you looked really closely, you even saw Civil War vets marching in the parade and others. But yeah, Henry Ford was involved and brought a lot of activities, a lot of the exhibits from the museum and from the Henry Ford area and down from Dearborn. He really loved Northville. He spent his honeymoon here, and he had relatives out here. He did a lot besides building the Ford valve plant. With that, I thought I'd do some of the highlights over time in Northville. What made Northville different in the community? And the most important thing, if you have questions, I'll open it up at the end for any questions that you have on your mind. And Wendy will be kind of the conduit, and she'll tell you how to ask those questions. Put your hand up via chat. We'll answer all those. So with that, let's start with this first slide. Northville used to be the ski jump capital of all of Michigan. In fact, a lot of the world record holders came to Northville and ski jumped. That's the hill on your right-hand side. You can see he's in the air, and even on the left-hand side, that was in the Detroit Free Press back in the 1920s. Now the hill, if you want to envision where the hill is, if you're on 7 Mile coming from Northville Downs, and you come up to where Hines Drive is, Hines Drive goes one way, and Northville Road or 7 Mile goes to the left, stop right there. Look to the right, and it's a big hill. On top of that hill, there's about a 60 to 70-foot platform that went straight up. That's what you see. The skiers would climb all the way to the top of the hill, all the way top of the platform, and the runway would be that straight road from Hines Drive to where Good Time Party Store is today. That wasn't a road. That was just the landing strip for the ski jump hill. So that's kind of the rest of the story. That wasn't a road to get into Northville. That was just where they went skiing a whole bit. So let's take a look at another picture there, another activity in Northville. Second, right down there in Northville Downs, we used to host the largest fair really in the state. It rivaled the state fair. This was the Wayne County Fair, and this is the Wayne County Fairgrounds, and people came from all over the Tri-County area to come to Northville. In fact, they had big tents, they had races on the track, they had all the animals around. The high schoolers, they would sell enough concessions to send everybody to Washington, D.C. for their senior trip, just from proceeds from the fair. It was in the Norfolk Record, many articles. Everybody in town, all the merchants would sell out all their food. All the restaurants were lined up for people, and a lot of merchandise was sold down there. Most of the merchants had booths down at the fairgrounds. So a lot of activity, you know, three-ring circuses going on. They had the horse races, they had the carnival, they had the different areas for all the rides, and it was quite a festive occasion. My dad would talk about it all the time because he grew up on Fairbrook, right up the street from there. And they would go down there. My grandfather, and I didn't mention it earlier, one of my grandfathers was the electrician of town, one was the barber of town. The electrician would wire everything for the activity down at Northville Downs at the big fair. So it was kind of a family affair. So that gives you a little flair about what used to go on once in a while for a few weeks down at Northville Downs. Let's take a look at the next one, Wendy. So Northville and the river's converging. Northville is quite unique. We're the highest point in Wayne County. We have the only lake in Wayne County. We have 3 rivers converging right here. We have the Rouge, we have the Johnson Creek, and we have the Randolph Drain. 2 of them converge right there by Ford Field and the Mill Race, and just downstream by Northville Downs, that's where the Johnson Creek comes in. So we're not only the highest point in Wayne County, but we're kind of called the Switzerland of Wayne County too, because the hills, the rolling hills in and out, when the glaciers came through, it stopped ever so slightly and deposited all those, the minerals, and Why did we have all the gravel pits? You just can't make gravel pits. That's where in the day when the glaciers came through, it deposited all that gravel here in Norfolk. That's why Moraine School is called Moraine. That's on the moraine, or the edge of where the sand and the gravel pits can really be. So that gives you an idea. A lot of water, a lot of beauty in Norfolk. The topography is outstanding. Next one. The Fish Hatchery, Fish Hatchery Park. Bob Nix is on the call here tonight, or on the activity. He and I are working very diligently to bring the river back to what it used to be and its naturalization. The Fish Hatchery Park, and people don't even know why it's called the Fish Hatchery Park. It was the first national fish hatchery in all of North America. A guy called Clark was in charge of it. He had about 13 or 14 different ponds. You see that one pond back there? Imagine 13 or 14 of those, and a bunch of swim lanes of different fish, 3 or 4 of these type of buildings, all housing different kinds of fish. The only remaining building that's original is on the opposite side of the road. That was the superintendent's house. There's a little pond in front of that. That is going to be on the National Historic Sites. It is, again, the first fish hatchery. This guy who started it, Mr. Clark, he went to another town and they named it after him, Clarkston. So that's the rest of the story on the fish hatchery. Just one other thing about the fish hatchery. They used to keep one pond open for all the Northvillians to come swim every summer. So they would clean one out, and that was the swimming hole for all of Northville. Some of the boys, I was told by my father, who were a little bit more risque, there was a little pond in the back of Rural Hill Cemetery, and they would be bathing a little bit with and without all their suits of life. So sometimes their bathing suits were their birthday suits. So the next picture. Back in the Northville area, the biggest train wreck in North America at one time happened July 20th, 1907, out of Napier Road and 5 Mile, which is really today the Northville Township area. People have been scouring that area for remnants, for decades and decades. At the time, it was a group from the Pierre Marquette coming on a Sunday afternoon, coming down from Ionia, Michigan, and they were going to go down to Belle Isle for a big celebration. All the people working for the Pierre Marquette, it was a big trip. So they came down from Ionia, Michigan, and they got to that curve on Napier and 5 Mile. Little did they know, there's a freight train coming the other way, and they never made it to Belle Isle that day. And this is some pictures on that. I think, as the stats showed, 37 people were killed on that, and over 100 people injured. There was a huge trial on who was at fault, and it was at a little place called the Ice Rink, which is down, it used to be right behind or right in front of where CVS is, behind the theater today, and that was called the Princess Rink. And at that Princess Rink, all the reporters from all around the country came to get this news story, because there's no internet back then, was there? There's no TV back then, was there? Or nor radio. Everything was written down. So a huge activity at the Princess Rink. That's where everything happened in town. That's where they did roller skating. That's where they had dances. That's where they met. So that was the largest structure, and it was on the national news, Norfolk, to see who was at fault on this big train wreck. So that's the big train wreck, the Northville train wreck, which is really the Salem train wreck out there, they call it too. That was on Napier and 5 Mile back in 1907. Let's take a look at the next one, Wendy. Mayberry Sanitarium. So even when I was a kid, back in the late 60s, this was an arch that was on 7 Mile and Beck. And of course, Beck was all dirt back then. Beck has just recently been paved in the last few decades, but you would come all the way down 7 Mile and go into this grand entrance. Mayberry Sanatorium was one of the largest tuberculosis centers for the treatment. What was the treatment back then? Fresh air, good weather. They would try to sterilize things in the whole bit. They didn't know what really the cure was, but to get fresh air and get out in the country. We were out in the country back then. Mayberry Sanitarium, which is Mayberry State Park today, was a city in itself. I think they could house 787 patients out there. They had a women's dormitory, they had a men's, they had a children's area, they had nurses, different housing. Off of Beck Road, where you come in, if you come all the way up Main Street and Beck, on the other side are small brick buildings. That's where all the doctors lived back there. Dr. Romanek, I believe, was one of the last doctors there. My dad used to do history tours of what it was right up until 1969. Is in operation from about 1922 to about 1969. Again, at the end, the county owned that. It became a state park there, and that's what you know the rest of the story on Mayberry. Just my dad was very colorful in a lot of his stories. Back in the day, our family owned the North Electric shop where Baby is, and they always wanted TVs out there and installed all the patients. A lot of electricians wouldn't go out there, so my dad would go out there and put TVs in for different patients and the whole bit. One day, they needed some electrical work done, and one of the electricians, I think Herb Fisher was his name, that worked for my grandfather and my father, went out there and he's doing some wiring up in the rafters, and all of a sudden, it was above where the nurses came in for the showers, and he didn't know what to do. Somebody came in there and he dropped his hammer, and she did a scream. They've asked for that person to be fired because he was peeping. He wasn't. I've heard this story kind of uniquely from my father and my grandfather, but Herb Fisher lived to go out there another day in the whole bit. But that's the rest of the story on Mayberry. So when you're walking those trails and even those paths, those used to be the roads that connected one building to another. When you go out there next time, take a look at the signs. You can envision what the buildings were. They have some pictures of where the buildings sat out there. Again, a city in itself, a farm in itself, self-supporting out there. Let's take a look at the next one, Wendy. This is right on Katy Street, right where the library is today, just right down the street. May 8th, 1959, a military jet went way up in the air. And my brothers used to talk about this. I'm the youngest of a big Catholic family in town. They were playing ball in 1959, and they heard a jet come up over Northville, went straight up. Well, this jet ejected the pilot and went up and started coming straight down. It came straight down right on Katy Street, about 3 from Katy and Roger Street, just a short distance from the library. Came down, and there were 2 little children playing in the backyard. It was the King family, and Mr. King was a police officer and a new chief of police there at Northville. Little did he know it was his house. The plane was coming down, and the 2 kids were playing in the back area, and the library just did a whole presentation with these 2 kids. The young girl got her foot caught playing by the swings in a rut. The little boy came back, and the plane came down and exploded in the backyard with jet fuel and everything all over. They were hospitalized for quite some time. They told this story at a presentation at the library last year. I was fortunate enough to attend that. Eyewitnesses, the 2 people that were caught in that fire, the police chief came running home. I have a friend, Jean Angel from the Methodist Church. Her in-laws lived 2 houses away, and they had heard at the bank that a plane came down. She was a teller at the bank. She came running right down Main Street with her high heel shoes to see what was going on. She told that story when we had this presentation at the Methodist Church. She knew all about that. So that's the day, May 8th, 1959. Huge jet plane came right down right there on Katy Street. Everybody was involved, the FBI, the federal government, along with the local state police and our law enforcement. That's the rest of the story there. Let's take a look at the next one, Wendy. So this building still stands. This was the Yarnell Gold Cure Institute House. So this is across the street today from where the Early Bird restaurant is. People would come from all over the country if they had a drug addiction, they were with drugs or alcohol, they came to get cured. And what was a cure? To take gold pills. And across the street from this, the Gold Cure house was a boarding house. And you probably see that today. If you go down by the Early Bird, that house is raised up. And do we have a picture of that, Wendy? I can't remember. So this picture is the boarding house for the Gold Cure. This was from the 1860s until the early 1900s. People came from all over to stay for a month or so to get cured of their drug addiction or their alcohol addiction, and they would stay at this boarding house. So this was a big deal in Northville just recently to save this house for its historical value. As you can see, the house is to the left. Just recently, they took the front porch off. They've raised the house up. It's going to be moved a whole 6 feet one way and 4 feet another, and a whole brand new foundation is being built. So there's a whole movement to save this historic structure. And as you probably know, I'm all about history. If we don't look at our history, we don't know where to go really in the future. This is one that actually deserved to be saved, because once you rip something down, you really can't rebuild that. So that's the rest of the story, why that structure is being saved. That was the old boarding house, and if they came in on the train, which we'll talk about, they would stay right there at this boarding house, along with people from the Yarnell Center. So that's the rest of the story on that one. Let's take a look. So this picture, see if anybody can recognize about where that river is going. That is right down by the cider mill. That was the Rogers family, which is Rogers Street is named after. And they built a little house afterwards, and I'll let you try to think, which house did they build in town? They came up with something called condensed milk. And condensed milk was patented right here in Norfolk, Michigan, initially right off of 7 Mile and Rogers Street area, where Joe Denton Park is. There's a little park there. That was their first factory. And it got so busy and they couldn't keep up. They needed to get the production out. They built this facility. This is right across the street from the Norfolk Cider Mill. And they would put, the railroad tracks would go right by, and they would put all their condensed milk right on the rail cars, and it would be shipped out of Northville. They were so successful that the Rogers family, who Rogers Street is named after, and they owned this section of town at one time, they built a house. That house is still there today. It's really over in Novi, and that is on 9 Mile and Novi Road, called Shiro's today. That was the Rogers Mansion. So that's the rest of the story on that. But condensed milk, again, Norfolk was a booming place, a lot of activity back in the day. Let's take a look at another slide. So on this one, this is over in Cabbagetown. And people look at this and go, well, what's going on here? This is the famous house. An icicle came down off of it. And at the time, the neighbor was going over and trying to help the next neighbor who was sick and was shaking the door. Icicle came down, and it's in our local cemetery on Katy Street. The icicle came down and killed her, and they named the street after her right there. That's the rest of the story on the tombstone. It talked about it, and I think Saturday they're going to talk about some of the activities up there. So Rayson Street, that's Mrs. Rayson, lived in this house, and the icicle came down and killed her. So that's the rest of the story. That is Cabbagetown, and Cabbagetown is called Cabbagetown. A lot of Irish lived in that area, a lot of cabbage patches in the whole bit. So it wasn't a derogatory term. It was just, that was that section of town. And we'll talk at the end, maybe the 4 sections. Let's take a look at the next one, Wendy. Parmiter's Cider Mill. Parmiter's Cider Mill is one of the oldest businesses in Northville. Norfolk Lumber is #1, starting in 1827. Right after the Civil War, Mr. Parmiter came home from the Civil War along with a friend from the war. They started up the cider mill right there where it's at, right there on Baseline Road. And Baseline Road was really the only way to get into Northville back in the day from 8 Mile There was no 8 Mile that came around with a Massey Mansion, with a Chase Mansion. You came in 8 Mile by Highland Lakes, and you came down that road, Baseline Road, right by the Cider Mill. The bridge wasn't over the railroad track. Griswold was not a street coming in. That was all gravel pit area. So everybody coming in 8 Mile would come by the Cider Mill. Opposite side of the street of the Cider Mill was where Rogers had his condensed milk. Next to Rogers, then later on, was the Northville Lumber. So that was kind of the beginning of the businesses. You'd come all the way up to Center Street, take a left, and if you're going out towards South Line, go out Randolph Street. So a lot of action at the Cider Mill. Back in the late 70s, that original building burned, and they rebuilt the building back in the 70s, later 70s, and that's what you see today. But again, one of the older businesses in Northville. That's the rest of the story on the Northville Cider Mill, the Palm Ridge Cider Mill. Let's take a look at the next one. So the Northville Opera House. So where you're looking there, that's on the corner of Center Street and Dunlap. So that would be the southeast corner. Kind of like a little white building. It was a coney, it was a flower place. They're going to build a new building, just got approved, just like this. If you look, 1, 2, 3, that's kind of a 4-story building. A 4-story building is going to go up there just like it was back then. The construction for this building was started in the 1860s by Mr. Little, who was in charge of the Norfolk Record. It took about 10 years to build it, piece by piece. He did a lot of the work. He kept raising money. It housed more than 800 people. In its heyday, it was one of the most magnificent opera houses in all of Southeast Michigan. Henry Ford came to town and wanted that for Greenfield Village. The problem is, once the person found out it was Henry Ford, he wanted even more for this, in the 1930s. It was coming at a state that, almost it needed so much work. Henry Ford wanted to bring that down to the village down there. Well, the end of the story, Henry Ford was only going to pay X amount. He never moved up to the person's price. And the person said, well, I'd like to sell it to you, but Henry said, hey, you can take it down brick by brick for that price. And that's exactly what happened to that. So that used to be a magnificent building. All the high school graduations, different operas, different musical activities were there all the way up until the 1950s, the later 1950s. They tore that down right before I was born. My father would talk about that. My father had a graduation in there, and my brothers, it was still around back then too. So that used to be the rest of the story. Later on, they had a butcher on the main floor, and they didn't even use the opera house. So again, stay tuned in the coming months. In spring, ground will be broken, and there'll be a new building almost the same size with a restaurant on the first floor and some condos on the second, third, and fourth floors. So that's the rest of the story. Again, Dunlap and Center Street. So take a look when you're driving through Norfolk. The Interurban. So in Northville, talk about mass transit. We're all trying to work that out, aren't we? To get down to Detroit and work around in the counties and get down to the airport. Well, they had it kind of figured out up until about the late 1920s. We had multiple streetcar activities. You can see 2 different kinds of streetcars from 2 different companies. One would come right down Main Street where Norfolk Road sweeps around the curve by the car wash, by the Norfolk Well, up by the Norfolk Valve Plant, come up the hill, come almost up to Center and Main Street. And then they would reverse it and it'd go the other way. There were 2 routes. One would go down to Griswold, take a left and go up to Farmington, then over to Pontiac. Another one would go down Norfolk Road to Plymouth, down to Detroit. Back in the day, I'm told you could make it to Detroit in 55 or 60 minutes. Today, sometimes you hardly can do that with traffic. We don't have as much traffic right this second, but that was the first kind of mass transit in the area. One story that my dad used to tell, and my dad was a storyteller, back when he was a kid, about 8 or 9, a bunch of kids decided to grease up the tracks. where the streetcar would come up the hill, up through Main Street, you know, from Griswold Street down by the Northville valve plant, you know, where Planet Fitness is, come up the street, and it would stop in town. Well, when it came to stop in town, they greased the track all up. The conductor put the brakes on, and it kept sliding. I think we have a picture eventually. There used to be a big crow's nest in the middle of Center Street and Main Street. It knocked it down, and that whole cow catcher in the front hit it, knocked the crow's nest down where all the bands used to play. It was never put back up again. That was in the late 1920s. My dad was one of those kids. Spaggy, whose relatives still own the building next to it, he talked about those kids. He was pretty old when I was a kid. He talked about those kids that greased up the tracks. So as Paul Harvey said, that's the rest of the story on that one. Let's take a look at the next one, Wendy. Sessions Hospital. So Sessions Hospital is where today, does anybody know what it's called? Star Manor. That's right there on Main Street. All the babies were born in Northville from about 1922 to about 1961. A good friend of mine, Luigi Foligno, was one of the very last people born in Sessions Hospital. Dr. Snow was there, Dr. Sessions before that it was named after. Dr. Snow's daughter married the mayor of Northville. Let's see if you can remember who that is. Probably not. Betty Allen is her name today. Allen Terrace is named after she and her husband. So she was a nurse really working for her father, helping deliver a lot of those kids in town. But that's a landmark that's been around a long time. Again, we know it as Sessions Hospital back then. Today, Star Manor. So a lot of history. If you look to the right, you can kind of see the elevator shaft that they would bring people up and down to the next story, and the beds, the big square edifice in the middle. So it was still a hospital when I was born and around. I was like the first baby born in St. Mary's, you know, kind of a modern hospital, but most people were born right there. I was the only one in the family that wasn't born there. So that's the rest of the story on Sessions Hospital. Let's take a look at the next one, Wendy. So this one is kind of near and dear to my heart. So originally, in Northville, you know, there's a lot of outstanding books, and they're at the library. And the greatest one is Northville, the First 100 Years. And I would always suggest take a look at this one. There is step by step that my dad did tours of the city of Northville. An old one called The Ideal Suburban Village, back about 1900 to late 1800s. The latest History of Northville book is this one by Michelle Feck. Just an outstanding book. She did a great job on this. On the cover, you see to the left picture, the original Norfolk Electric Shop that's where my grandfather had his business, and my father was born in 1919 upstairs. That's right across today from where Bricks used to be. That's going to be Lashish in the future. Joe's Coney Island, kind of across the street from that. That was the original Norfolk Electric Shop. And people would come over and have my dad sign because on the cover it said, this is where Bruce Turnbull was born. He got a real kick out of that. In about 1930, a group came to town and a brand new building was built. Today, where Baby is, that building on the right, that's pretty modern, a brick building, about a year old, built in about 1929. Hardware moved in there and got guns and other artifacts that was worth some money. Depression hit, group came to town, guy called Dillinger. Dillinger and his gang came in, they kicked in the back door and stole all the guns and anything of worth. In the Depressionary times, they had no money. The bank took over the building, and my grandfather, who had $1 or $2, ended up buying that building. So when I was a kid, that was the Norfolk Electric Shop. And even the back door, even when I was a kid, was this big piece of sheet metal that was all screwed together, where they had kicked in the bottom of the door. They had bolted the top, but they had broke through the door, and everybody got in and took anything of value inside, most of the guns. But I always thought it would be pretty neat at the mill race to have an exhibit the day Dillinger came to town and look at that door. I went there quite a few years ago to see if that door is still there. No, they'd put a new modern door. That piece of sheet metal was gone in the door with it. So that's the day Dillinger came to town. Let's take a look at the next one. Silver Springs. Silver Springs, Norfolk was known for a lot of things. This was right down there by where the Norfolk well is. Across the railroad tracks on the other side, they used to have, that's called the Silver Springs area. That is where the natural lake in town, Curtis Lake, which is in the Highland Lakes area. That's the only natural lake in all of Wayne County. The rest are dammed up rivers, or they just dug up different gravel pits. That is the only natural lake, and that's fed by the Silver Springs area. In this factory, they would not only do bottled water, and it was pretty fancy bottled water, like Absolute Pure spring water and what have you. They would serve that on the trains, you know, those big things of water they would put on. They would serve it at fine restaurants and the whole bit. It was so bubbly and natural, they made grape pop and orange pop out of that. My dad used to talk about getting the pop from there. The local Questers group called themselves the Silver Springs Questers group, that is antiquers, because of Silver Springs. Again, it serviced most of the railroads that came through town. They would stop at the Norfolk station, which we'll look at in a second, and fill up with jugs of Norfolk spring water and bring some of that spring water down to J.L. Hudson's downtown Detroit and other places with the big containers to put on. That happened on a daily basis. That's, again, where the Northville well is. Up from there, what Chamber of Commerce, you know, the stitching post, opposite side of the railroad track. That's where they used to do Silver Springs water. Let's take a look at the next one, Wendy. So right next to that, that was the Northville train station. And still today, if you walk up, I don't know if I advise this, I know I'm told I'm a little wild once in a while, but if you go up from where the Northville well is, or the Chamber of Commerce, go up over the railroad track, you can still see the foundation where the Northville train station was. And a lot of the bricks that are still from the foundation are still laying around there. I had a presentation a year or two ago. I went up there and grabbed a couple of bricks. You can see some of the cement foundations where they used to grab the mail. The train sometime would go by and they would grab the mail with a big hook, you know, a big bag would be out there, and they had a big platform of cement. My dad used to talk about that. He was one of the kids who put the bag out there, you know, on that platform. But that, again, to get in and out of Northville, we were a major stop. Believe it or not, Meads Mill in the township there was a bigger town than Northville. The Mead brothers had a huge mill, one of the better mills, and one of the biggest mill races where you dam up the water and you go from a 2-foot pipe to 1-foot pipe to a 6-foot pipe, and it just rushed the water around the mill and the mechanism. It was renowned for its mill work there. The only problem they didn't have in Meads Mill, and they called the town Meads Mill or Waterford to some, and they had a bigger station than we did. They didn't have a church. You don't have a church, I guess you're not going to survive. They had the mill and a lot of houses. Look behind Meads Mill. Look at some of those old houses and the buildings. That was the town of Waterford or Meads Mill back in the day. Let's take a look at the next one, Wendy. So another big industry in town through the 1920s, airplanes. Almost unbelievable that people didn't realize airplanes were built right here in Northville, Michigan. Really, one of the very first modern planes, a guy called Stinson, who lived right on Eaton Drive and Thayer. They just redid his house. Thank goodness they didn't take the house down. They revised the house at the end of Eaton Drive, runs right into Thayer. That's where Mr. Stinson lived. My grandfather wired his factory. The factory is to the upper left. That is right down there by where the hangar is, or the village workshop. It says the hangar area on the village workshop. That is the vicinity exactly where they built planes. It was the first modern single-wing plane. In fact, later on in the 30s, they sold the rights to this after Stinson unfortunately passed in an aircraft accident, sold it to Piper. This is what the Piper Cub became. If you go down to Greenfield Village and you go into the museum down there, there's 2 Stinson Aircrafts up in the rafters. Take a look. They were all built here in Northville, Michigan up until the late 1920s. You just saw that parade in 1927. That was the Stinson Aircraft without the wings, with Eddie Stinson behind the cockpit going through town. What they would do, they would drag that fuselage all the way through town and go out to Beck Road and 6 Mile area and put the wings on and fly them off. There's an airport out there. So they would test fly each and every one of those planes. People would see planes fly around Norfolk and they would deliver them from there. There's a story that I talked about not too long ago. Eddie Stinson had a great friend, wanted to get married, went to get a marriage license. And, you know, that's a great opportunity. I didn't know I'm the Justice of the Peace. I've married 9 people since the beginning of the year, and there's 8 more down at the mill race. And I understand you need some time, 3-4 weeks, sometime to get a marriage license. He had a great buddy who wanted to get married. He needed that time in Michigan, but Ohio didn't have a waiting period. So they got Eddie Stinson's plane. They brought the Methodist minister from Northville in the plane. They got the marriage license in Toledo. They got up in the air. They got married in the air right there in Ohio. So they were legal and they landed right back here in Northville. So that's kind of a neat story. It was documented in the Norfolk Record. The Norfolk Record really has all the documentation from the mid-1800s all the way to now. It was the largest local paper in all of this area. Everybody got their news from the Norfolk Record, and it's a great reference for history around here. They've done a great job through the years there, but a lot of my information comes from that in the archives, and Wendy Much does an outstanding job. Wendy Much is a historian for Norfolk history at the library, helps me out on all these presentations and make sure I'm saying the exact dates, because I have a lot of information in my head from all the stories. I usually read everything, and when in doubt, I ask Wendy, because she is the expert. So that's about the Stinson Aircraft factory. So you can see Norfolk had a lot going on. Just right across the street from the Stinson Aircraft factory was a big foundry, and the foundry made a lot of metal parts. We're going to look at the next picture in a second. All the metal parts were built there for school desks and sometimes furniture for churches and what have you. Later on, it was one of the largest bell producers in North America. In fact, the largest bell is in the old Methodist Church, which is on Dunlap and Center Street, which is the stamp peddler today. Up in that tower is a huge Norfolk bell. If you see any of those bells, look at it. I bet you'll see in the stamping of it, it says Northville, Michigan. So that if you go by Katy Street, this is right across the street from where the car wash is, where the hangar areas, you know, the village workshop. That is the old building dating back to the 1800s. Even if that is developed in the future, that building is very historic in the front. Something may or may not happen to that building. Let's take a look at the rest of the story picture of what happened in that area. Not only was the foundry there, but the foundry was there really to make the metal parts to all the school desks. Northville, believe it or not, at one time was the largest producer at the Globe Furniture Factory of school desks in North America, like the desk you see to the right there. We had a couple of those around at our house that I donated. 250 people working a shift at the Globe Furniture Factory. Where is that? So that is where, across from the Northville Well, from the Chamber of Commerce, where they redid that building called the Studebaker Building. That is on the foundation of a piece of the Globe Furniture Factory. Mr. Beal was the superintendent and the CEO of the Globe Furniture Factory. Mr. Beal built the whole town kind of around him, housing. That's called Bealtown today. So that's where it gets its name from Mr. Beal, who was in charge of the Globe Furniture Factory, one of the largest producers of church and school furniture in all of North America. So that, again, they keep finding different pieces of different foundations. The problem is, back then, a lot of things, they were working with wood, a lot of chemicals. It had multiple fires through the days. Eventually, by the 1920s and 30s, it was a much smaller operation. A story in our family was one of the Globe Furniture Factory craftsmen who worked on the wood came to the Norfolk Electric shop in the Depression, trying to keep his family alive, and he did great work, inlaid work on a different clockwork, building like grandmother clocks. He built this beautiful grandmother clock without the clock in it. He came to my grandfather, who was an electrician, and said, "Hey, if you put a clock in there, somebody will buy that." He goes, "I really need to sell that." And my grandfather goes, "Well, I'll give you $5. Oh, he went wild. My grandfather, "Wait, I'll give you $5 for 6 weeks. And that was enough to keep his family alive and going through those winter months. But at the beginning, $5, no. But my grandfather could only give him so much money every month. That was one of the most prized possessions that we had in our household. My grandfather loved that clock. My dad inherited that clock. When my father recently passed, my oldest brother, all he wanted was that clock. So that clock has been going down in generations. It still has the old electric mechanism from the electric store. Doesn't work, but it really doesn't matter. It's the stories that's what's important on that one. So that's a little bit about the furniture factory. A lot going on in Norfolk down in that section. The next picture, Wendy. So winding down here, look, this is the old Methodist Church. Again, the stamp peddler right there on Dunlap and Center Street. Up in that clock tower right below that, that's where that big bell is. You can kind of see that open area where the sound would permeate through Northville. A story that was told when I was a kid about when WWJ or WJR became a radio station in Detroit. My grandfather, was a big electrician and sold all these radios and stuff where baby is. He was big in the Baptist church, in charge of the school and Sunday school, and an elder. That was a little conservative for my grandmother. She was a big Methodist in town at this church, and she wanted everybody to get together and hear this new thing out there. What was this new thing? There's no internet. There was no TV. They came up with this thing called radio. So my grandfather, this was the highest kind of edifice. This was the highest building, the highest tower in town. He put a big copper wire all the way up to the top and a big old tube radio up on the altar. They announced it at church the week before. All the congregations got together at the Methodist Church. And my grandfather was up there in the Methodist Church, even though he was a Baptist. And my mother grew up Catholic, so we got all those religions handled. But he wired everything up, and all of a sudden everybody was quiet. He turning the knobs, and all of a sudden it came, WJR from the Fish Hatchery in downtown Detroit, and everybody clapped and went wild. Pretty wild. Think about it today. We just take the internet for granted. We take TV for granted. That's the first time they had heard radio in the city of Northville. So I heard that story quite a few times from my grandfather growing up, and my father too, especially. Kind of neat. But what was neat about that, all the congregations in town got together to listen to that together. I guess they had a hymn sing before and a hymn sing afterwards, listen to a little show on WJR. So that's that. Next one, Wendy. So our kind of little Greenfield village, winding down, I wanted to leave time for any and all questions here. Our Greenfield village is really our historic area, is the mill race. Henry Ford loved Northville. He came here and celebrated his honeymoon in the 1880s. He had a cousin that lived right up there on Center Street, closer to the hillside on the other side of the road. Loved Northville, came out here quite a bit. He liked it so much, he came back and he built a plant in Northville. He bought from the Norfolk Lumber Company their lumber activity. That's where the valve plant is today. He took over their buildings in the 1920s. In the later 1930s, my grandfather helped wire this new wild building that produced every valve for Ford's engines right here in Northville, Michigan. Henry was big on the village plants and the village workshops. He wanted power right from the water. So he did high power up and down from Dearborn to Norfolk. If you look about every 5 miles, there's different plants. Norfolk was one of the last areas he bought, but one of the first ones to go into operation. There's another one just on the other side of 6 Mile and Northville Road. The facility is still there. There's one out there going down the Parkway in Plymouth. There's another one over in Livonia. So look, as you go down the Norfolk Parkway and there's tours up and down, it comes all the way out to Norfolk and all the way to Dearborn. He would produce those activities, whether it's instruments in one, valves in another, seat materials in a third, and bring it to Dearborn for a final production. So Northville had a huge work amount of people, 200 to 300 people a shift, Northville Valve Plant. Everybody in my family worked there except me. By then it was winding down its activity. And that's where Planet Fitness is today. That's an Albert Kahn designed building, and he's a famous designer, as you probably all know out there. But Henry Ford loved the town so much. He helped bolster up the pond. Again, we talked about 8 Mile. When you came in 8 Mile, you came through by Highland Lakes and Baseline Road, coming down by Norfolk Cider Mill and the Norfolk Lumber Company. And by the way, the middle of that road, one side, the Norfolk side, is in Wayne County. Norfolk Lumber is in Oakland County. That's the Baseline Road. All the roads, all the counties in the state of Michigan are off that Baseline Road. There was no 8 Mile again that came around that hooked up back by Taft Road, where you came through Hillside, which used to be the old high school where the football field is. That was Taft Gravel Pit, thus Taft Road. That's why where they play football, it looks like it's down, in the valley. That was dug out gravel, and they put the stands on the side there. So they put that road through. If you look where the bridge goes across, came right through the gravel pit. But Henry Ford did so much for Northville. Coming in, I was talking about the roads. 7 Mile used to come in from where Haggerty is, from where the state hospital used to be, come down to Norfolk Road. What did we say when we started? That road where Good Time Party Store, that wasn't a road. That was the landing strip area for the ski jumpers. You would have to come in Norfolk Road, all the way through town, Main Street to Rogers, and Rogers out to 7 Mile. Where St. Lawrence Estates condos are today, on the other side of Norfolk Downs, just to the edge of them, a huge pond called Balboa Lake and Ambler Pond. The Amblers go back, we go back only 5 generations. The Amblers go back 9 or 10 generations in town. That used to be Ambler Pond and Lover's Lane. My dad, even in the 30s, growing up on Fairbrook, used to have his canoe on one side, and that pond went all the way to Rural Hill, almost to the Fish Hatchery Park. If you look today, especially in late spring or early fall, you can kind of see where the dikes, the dirt mounds are on either side. That was the edge of the pond. When they drained that pond, that became the road. That 7 Mile that goes through there today. So that's, again, how 7 Mile came into being. That was not until the late 50s. So until then, everybody had to come through town, whether 7 Mile or 8 Mile. So that's why there was a lot of traffic through town. But what you see here is our, again, little greenfield village. And my parents and others in town were instrumental in bringing these buildings that were historic in town. It's kind of a living museum. I just recently, last weekend, went over to the Plymouth Museum, which I think is outstanding, right downtown there. I think ours has its attributes too, because it's a living, walking museum. We're kind of a greenfield village kind of museum. So I hope you have a chance to walk around the grounds of the mill race. I hope you have a chance to go down to the library and kind of see a little bit about what the history, what it really was about Norfolk, walk around our historic streets. We said early on, we'll talk about the four burbs in town. We kind of talked about them. Bealtown, Mr. Beal, there's a quiz at the end here. Mr. Beal was in charge of the Globe Furniture Factory, the CEO, and helped built Bealtown. That is why that section is named that way. Cabbagetown, a lot of Irish in town. They had a lot of cabbage patches. That was Cabbagetown. The historic district is right downtown. Mr. Dunlap owned a lot of that land. They almost called it Dunlapville and some other name. Finally, we were called Northville because we're the North Village in this section of the county. We're north of Plymouth. Plymouth sectioned off that way. Northville was the North Village of Plymouth. So that is the historic area that the historic streets, all the way from Katy Street and Main Street and Dunlap and our downtown section. The last area in town is Orchard Heights. Orchard Heights is out there from Roger Street almost up to Clement, from 7 Mile to Main Street. That was the old Eaton farmhouse at one time on Roger Street, which they just redid it. The big stone house, that was the old farmhouse. The second house in the area was the house I grew up. It was the Eaton house of Eaton Drive. The old farmer built that for his son. This whole area used to be an orchard. They used to bring things down to the Eastern Market. His sons, which were in their late 90s, not too many years ago, came over and told me all about how they'd pick pears and apples and raspberries and bring it down to the farmer's market. So envision the farm in this area at one time went from Rogers to Clement, from 7 Mile to Main Street. The family probably made more money when they subdivided the orchard up. Thus, this area is called Orchard Heights. Farmhouse on Rogers. Eaton Drive was 365 Eaton Drive. They're just putting a new house up there after 100 years. And next to that, Kathy O'Brien lives in a house that was the grandmother's house. So that was the triad of homes, and the whole sub sprung up. So those are the four sections of town. So hopefully, if you had a question, we answered some of them. But I think that ends the presentation, doesn't it, Wendy? These are the pictures you put together. Again, I grew up with the stories, and I think the stories are as important as the history themselves. My dad was the greatest storyteller of town. He was one of the last in the Mohicans, one of the old timers, and I appreciate the stories more now than I ever have hearing from my grandparents and my father. At this point, I'd like to open it up, and I believe Wendy can tell you how you can raise your hand, and any question that you have on your mind, anything, I'll try to answer that. Wendy, it's all yours. Do we have any hand raisers at this point?
Michael. Michael.
Okay, you have several questions that came from the chat while you were discussing things.
Outstanding.
So Ron Seelig asked, what year did they build the bypass for 8 Mile?
Great. So both 8 Mile and 7 Mile. So in the late 50s, about 1957, I think, 1958, the bypass for 8 Mile. Again, how did you get into Northville? You came down 8 Mile. If you envision today, close your eyes, you're coming by from Haggerty down into Norfolk where Griswold is. There was no road that went straight. You had to come in Griswold by the Cider Mill and all the way around there into town and out Randolph. And I just sat on somebody's porch on Randolph. They were telling me how much traffic with the social district going on. I had to let them know this was one of the busiest streets ever until the late 1950s. So to answer that question, Michael, late 50s, 57, 58, I believe, depending on when they started and ended it. About the same time for 7 Mile on the other side that went from Norfolk Road past where John Mack or McDonald Ford used to be. And this year, a Good Time Party Store turns 50 years old. And that's, a little over 50 years ago, back about 70 years ago, I guess, how old am I? I'm 60. About 60 years ago, that's when that 7 Mile continued out to South Lyon. Again, how did you come through town from 7 Mile? 7 Mile over the railroad tracks, stopped, took a right on Norfolk Road. There was no Good Time Party Store. That was just a field where they landed. You came all the way through town, through Rogers, then out to 7 Mile, by Edenderry, that way. So hopefully that answers that question. Michael, other questions?
Oh, the next question on board is from Audrey, who asked this question while you were discussing baseline. She wondered if this is why Northville divided into 2 counties.
So we are very unique, aren't we all in life? Very unique and special. We're one of the few towns, we have about 54% of our voters that are in Oakland County and 46% in Wayne County. It's a denser area over by Ammerman. That's why we don't have as much space, but we have more people in that area. Baseline, came through town. Again, Novi was kind of a suburb of Norfolk. In fact, on that, all the Novi schools came to Norfolk High School until the 60s, till the mid 60s. So we had pretty good ball teams. A guy called Steve Juday and a group of others won all their football games, baseball, and basketball games. For only time it ever happened. And this Steve Juday went up to, as a quarterback, went up to Michigan State, and he was an All-American quarterback. We got a lot of linemen and really strong guys from all the farms out in Novi, and some of the skilled players and others. In between the 2 communities, they hosted a lot of athletes back then. So hopefully that answers the questions about the roads that way. So, and baseline was the road that cut through. Again, if you come from the Cider Mill sometime, coming towards town on baseline, look straight. That road goes exactly straight behind Hillside. That was a path that went up there. You couldn't really climb that. They used to have motorcycle climbs and others. That road in the back of Hillside where there's condos today, that continues the straight road right all the way up to Norfolk Swim Club, and that goes straight out to 8 Mile. That is the dividing line, but they couldn't get up that hill. That's why you had to come into town and go around. It was just the way the geography was set, and Norfolk was in both the counties because we were cultivating, a lot of that land. In fact, where Ammerman area is, where the Northville Lumber Company is, right next to the Northville Lumber Company to its west is a beautiful farmhouse, a beautiful lawn in the front. That is the old Yerkes farmhouse. The lumber mill is still, or Norfolk Lumber, is still in the same family. Stu Oldfield is the owner today. He's a descendant of the Yerkes. That was the Yerkes farm, and the Yerkes farm went 400 acres behind, all the way where Ammerman is, all the way across where 8 Mile is today into those homes. So that, it was in both counties. It's just the way it was laid out. We were the only community in that area. Next question, Michael.
Next question comes from Suzanne Heathcote, and she asked if you can tell a fish hatchery story and update on the work of the fish hatchery.
Ask me that again. You broke up a little, Mike.
She's asking if you can tell a story about the fish hatchery and update on the work there.
Sure. Okay, so 2 things. What was it in the old days? Of course, we said 13 ponds, and they dammed up the river before that for that big Ambler Pond or Balboa Lake, down on the other side of Rural Hill. That was a swimming hole back in the day, and behind Rural Hill Cemetery was a Wilder swimming hole for the boys in their birthday suit. Today, they're trying to bring, Bob Nixon, myself, with a lot of partners, there's $900,000 worth of work to bring that river back to its natural state. Instead of a big cement wall on one side, we're naturalizing the river on either side. You see a lot of work going on there right now. In fact, there's work going on in the city. There's subgroups talking about the last 60 years, they've tried to do a river walk in Northville. And I think we have a great chance of working with the Planning Commission and looking at our master plan long-term to do that. A river walk may come phase 1 all the way from the mill race area down to that park we own behind the valve plant today. We own that. Henry Ford used to own that, and the Ford Motor Company, we own that. And we saw a picture on the other side of the road of Boundary Flask. That has 5 acres on the river, all the way to Norfolk Downs. If we're so fortunate, one option might be to daylight the river down at Norfolk Downs. We don't own that, but we have to work with the developer. He has all the cards, but we are doing everything we can to do that as phase 1. Phase 2 of that Riverwalk might go up the Johnson Creek. The Johnson Creek goes right from the edge of Norfolk Downs by St. Lawrence Estates through that park that we just talked about that used to be a pond, all the way up to the Fish Hatchery. So that's kind of a story about the Fish Hatchery and what it was then. When I was a kid, most of those buildings were still up, and those big fish lanes, it looked like swim lanes, and those buildings were still there. Some were raised in the 1960s and some in the early 1970s, but I remember it when at the end of its lifespan, when it was the Fish Hatchery, and the township and the city have gotten together to put that together as a park, and that's where the tennis courts are and different activities and baseball and pickleball. We just did a pickleball court between Bob Nixon and myself on those because we're one of the biggest pickleball areas indoor. We had to put some outdoors with all this COVID-19. So a lot of action and a lot of effort. And Bob Nix has been up in Lansing, and I've been involved in others to make sure that the Johnson Creek stays pure and that the waste management facility isn't putting extra water in there and different pollutants. So we have a great natural resource, and we're doing everything we can to keep that. So that's a little bit more than you probably want to know about the fish hatchery. Go ahead.
Right. So the next question I have on board is from Sue. The next question I have on board is from Sue Gerbach, who asked, where is Cabbagetown specifically?
So where's Cabbagetown? So Cabbagetown would go from pretty much, that's a great question. You know where CVS is today? CVS all the way to 8 Mile, from almost Center Street to the fish to the Cider Mill, Parmiter's Cider Mill. That's that section of town where the mill pond is. Down there, Hutton Street, you know, is on one side from really, if you look, big landscape areas, Ford Field to almost 8 Mile. You can see where the newer homes in back of the Yerkes are. Probably from Ford Field to Baseline Road to the north, from the Parmiter's Cider Mill on one side all the way to Center Street. That would be my definition. In fact, we looked at in the classic book of the areas, Ford Field and the mill race are in Cabbagetown. And Wendy can correct me if I'm not right on this one. Is that correct, Wendy? I can see you. Good, good. Other questions, Michael?
Let's see, there's a question of somebody asking about Northville Downs.
Okay.
What
would they like to know about Norfolk Downs?
Yeah. And there's another one asking about what is the Village Workshop now?
So let me answer both those. I really don't know what they're asking about. So Norfolk Downs, historic athletic fields there, all the way from the 1800s. They had racing there, and then from about the 1930s to the 40s, they had official harness racing. But that has always been an athletic park. In fact, my father, who was the class president of 1937, my mother, who was a valedictorian of 36, my dad played football. He was captain of the football team and the president of the class. He played football in the middle of the track. That used to be the football field for Northville. They would go down there and everybody would go up and down the field back and forth. So a lot of athletic activities were there. They even had a little 9-hole golf course on the premise at one time. And again, what did we say earlier in the presentation? The county fairgrounds were there. A lot of activity in the past. In fact, that power station, which is right on the corner, you see all those electrical activities, which my grandfather helped, keep that going at one time. that was really the power station for the Globe Furniture Factory that DTE took over at one time on that. So I think they're probably asking me what is going on in the future there. So again, I guess I said you could ask me any question. In the future, Hunter Pastor is a developer that came in and made an agreement with the Carlo family and the driving club. In the years to come, something could be developed there. Probably Katy Street first in the next couple years, but again, they own the land. The Planning Commission is doing an outstanding job trying to look at our master plan and what we want in the future and work with the developer. We can do it with policies and procedures and ordinances and what have you, but we are working with them. I believe something might happen on Katy Street in the coming years. After that, it'll be developed lower in the area, closer to 7 Mile and Center Street. That will be houses and mixed use housing down there. We are trying to look at what are the options. In fact, there are some master plan updates for the Katy corridor coming up that many of you probably signed up for. The Planning Commission wants to hear from you. Do we want to open up the river? What do we want to do with the farmers market? What is important to you? So I think you're going to find there'll be different activities going to happen in the near future. And if we can integrate that into our walkable Northville, I think it should be outstanding. So that's what's going on there. Michael, what was the second part? You asked me about Northville Downs and you asked me about something else.
The other one was about what the Village Workshop building.
Oh, so the Village Workshop, again, we talked about that's where the Stinson Aircrafts used to be built, right in that kind of corridor area. That was the Globe Furniture Factory. That was a big industrial area, a lot going on. And the Foundry Flask, you know, where they did all the bells and all the foundry for the metal work, for all the desks built over there for the Globe Furniture Factory. A lot happening down there. In fact, right around the corner where the stitching post was, later on, that was a Studebaker dealership in town. I know that's old for some of you, but remember, we go all back to the Victorian day, don't we? So that was a big area. So to answer that question, in that area of the Village Workshop, that is a lot of different offices for different things. Dennis Erger owns that, and he has rented that space out, which I think is just a dynamic space. A brewery was going to go in there, you know, other activities, but I think it used to be the Village Workshop. You could go and you work on wood things, you could do quilting. They had all these different machines. I think it was a fabulous idea. It was probably ahead of its time right now, but I think he's rented out most of that space. It's a dynamic workspace and a great open area there and a lot of different offices. So that's what's going on there, Michael.
So your next question is from Don Stopper, who asked, do you know what happened? Do you know where the blacksmith shop was in Northville?
So the blacksmith shop, what you see down at the mill race is a reproduction of the blacksmith shop. And I believe the blacksmith shop was up off of Main Street and Hutton Street at one time on that corner, but it was what's built down at the mill race is a replica of the old blacksmith shop that used to be there in Norfolk. Because of course, 4 cars had to shoe your horses, you had to fix the wagons. That's where they were, right in downtown, right at the edge where you came up the hill in Northville. And I think if you go down to the mill race, they have great descriptions on each one of the buildings. It will tell you exactly where those buildings were at one time. That's one of the only buildings down there, that and the gazebo, which are reproductions of what used to be around Northville, or different edifices. The different homes were moved there. The Yerke home, the church, the school, the Katy Inn. The Katy Inn, that was still the Katy Inn, or a house right on Katy Street when I was a kid, down there by Church Street, down there Griswold to the right. So yeah, most of those houses I remember as a kid, it was quite something seeing these houses move through town over to the mill race area, taking down all the wires as they went. I was told my grandfather, you know, got a lot of electricity things going, and my dad later on, you know, did that, but they had to take all those different wires down to get those buildings in. So maybe that answered that question, Michael.
Hey, you have one more question here from Marcus. We have a question from Marcus Damager, who asked for someone who just moved to Northville, what would the mayor recommend to check out when interested further in Northville history?
So great question. One, walk around the mill race, get a feel for what Norfolk's all about. That is a living, working museum of structures that were here 100 years ago. We have more Victorian homes than just about any other community in the state of Michigan. We're going to have our bicentennial in 2027. Get a feel for that kind of Victorian flair. It's a little tough with COVID-19 to get a feel for everything at the mill race. Usually every weekend there's volunteers and docents that are working all the buildings, telling you everything. It's a tough time. We don't have all those volunteers working for your safety, quite honestly. But get a feel for the mill race, walk around town, walk around the historic area, look at the buildings. I envision by our bicentennial, we will have a historic walk. We will have different plaques that say what happened at each one of those buildings, a little bit about the buildings, almost like the Heritage Trail or the Freedom Trail in Boston, have a line going around and explaining it. I envision, autonomous cars. I envision horse and buggy rides. I envision electric Model Ts. I envision people doing walks. We should be a destination by our bicentennial, but that doesn't stop anybody new in town walking around the mill race. Walk down Dunlap. Dunlap Street is just outstanding, and Main Street. Look at those Sears homes that were brought in by rail cars, and all the wood and all the structures are there. They brought the rail car in full of stuff and they built a home. A lot of those down by Rogers and Dunlap were Sears homes. Just get an idea of what it was back in the day. They even ran horse races up and down Dunlap Street, on the straight, doing almost a quarter mile straight down Dunlap Street. The women in town, according to the Norfolk Record, were not very happy that the men were betting on horse races when it was all dirt roads down Dunlap Street. But I would absolutely get a feel for the mill race, get a feel for walking the downtown. We have a social district that you can walk around, look at the buildings, walk down the streets in downtown, walk down Dunlap, and go over to the library. Wendy Much is an expert. She's on here tonight. We have a whole room about Norfolk history. Get a feel for that. You don't have to know everything about history, but walk around. We have a great treasure in Norfolk. And if you go down to not only the mill race, but Ford Field, the river running right by it, it is outstanding. Spend some time, in this time of COVID, we're supposed to stay active, mentally, physically, and from a community level. You can do all three of those by having a nice walk through the mill race, through downtown, and through Ford Field. So that's what I would suggest to get a feel for what Norfolk is all about.
I had one more question come in. Sarah B.
You
asked,
slid one in on me, eh, Mike? Okay, good.
Sarah asked if we will have skeletons downtown this year.
Absolutely, absolutely. So that is an activity. We can spread them out. In years past, we would have a big event and kick it off. There's no big event to kick it off, but we are going to dress all those skeletons. Who knows? They might all have masks on them. There's even more skeletons than there used to be, but we're going to spread them out all the way from the Norfolk Valve plant where the fitness center is, all the way to City Hall down Main Street. So that is going to happen. I would invite people to come enjoy the social district. That will be the month of October. Those will be up. So it should be a great event. It'll be a different Halloween. And in my opinion, Norfolk is kind of the Norman Rockwell Halloween, isn't it? We shut down Dunlap Street. We have thousands and thousands of people. We have everybody coming into the Norfolk Fire Department. We open up the community for everybody around. This is a tough year to do that. There's a lot of discussion. First time in 155 years, we canceled the 4th of July parade. We canceled the Memorial Day parade. We have never done that in the history of Northville, and we're going to be 200 years old coming up. Halloween, it's killing me, but as Halloween is, again, the Norman Rockwell Halloween, I think of North America right here in Norfolk. If you go up and down Dunlap, people are doing stage production. There's bands playing, it's like Disney. it'll be a little bit different this year. We have to decide, do we shut down the streets? Do we not do? I don't know how we can open up the fire department and have all those people in, but the skeletons will be there. People will be walking around Northville. You'll be enjoying all the different ones in all different dress and garb, some Victorian, some with masks on, some representing different businesses. We've had more outcry from businesses that get more skeletons than we've ever had. So it should be great. I invite everybody to come downtown Northville. We are the city for Northville and Norfolk Township, and Bob Nix and I work together on an awful lot of things. We're really the town for a lot of Novi and for Livonia. We welcome everybody to enjoy Halloween in downtown Northville in our social district. Hopefully that answers that, Mike.
I think so. That's the last question I have right now. So
Excellent. If anybody has a question in the future, you can talk to Wendy Much at the library. I think my phone number was out there. You can text me. Don't everybody call me at the same time. It's on the city website. I probably answer 20 or 25 calls, emails, texts every day, probably 1 or 2, maybe 3 history activities. I used to do 1 or 2 history events every month. Since COVID started, it's a tougher deal, but my number is 248-505-6849, 248-505-6849. Just go on the city website. You can get a hold of me anytime, 24/7. Thank you so much. Have a great night. Thank you for all you do for Norfolk to help us get through COVID-19. Go out and reach out to our businesses, reach out to our seniors, reach out to your friends, bring them to Skeletons Alive in downtown Norfolk. Thank you. Have a great night now. See ya. Peace.